This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, Naomi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank God. I'm so happy that you wanted to talk to me today about something that interests both of us. And that's the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes. Yes, we're going to get into a very interesting topic, very interesting time in history, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's a cool name. It's a piece of writing is one way to put it, but I'll ask you how to define before I want to get into your personal, history and how you got into studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. But first, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Like, how would you describe it?
So in 1947, a Bedouin, I believe with either his brother or a cousin of his, was doing what teenage boys do. They were throwing rocks into a cave. And all of a sudden, he threw a rock into the cave, and instead of the rock hitting the side of the cave and having the echo of hitting the side of the cave, he hit pottery, like a pot, and he heard like that he broke a pot inside the cave. So I guess he was a brave kid, and he said, let me find out, why is there pottery in this cave? And he went in, must have been pretty scary, and there were these ancient pottery, like what we would make out of clay today if you went to one of those places that you could make pottery, and now they have you paint it and everything. So there's this ancient pottery. He took he took with him what he could take with him, and that became, I believe, the first set of manuscripts that would be called Cave 1 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And subsequent years, they found 9 additional caves for a total of, I think right now it's about 972 different manuscripts. Some of them are whole scrolls, like that's called the Great Isaiah Scroll, because that's like the most complete scroll. And most of the scrolls are fragments. Some of them are as small as a few words, some of them a few pages, and everything in between. So it was a tremendous find. They didn't find it all that day. It took years, took decades really, to go about finding all of these scrolls. And what happened to the scrolls and the recovery is definitely a movie. The political intrigue between the various factions in that time, I believe it was in the hands of Jordan. And so you have a lot of Christians, Jews, Bedouins, Palestinians, Jordanians, with laying a claim to both the geography and the research. Of course, it did end up in the hands of museums that are now currently housed in Israel. In fact, there's a museum dedicated to, I don't believe it's the only museum that has sections of it, but there's a museum of the scroll, of the book, the shrine of the book in Israel, that has a dedicated tremendous wing to the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can go and see it. If you're going to Israel, it's definitely worth the trip.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little tiny bit of the current history, which, like I said, I'm not really getting into all the details of how they bought back, how they found the Bedouin gave 3 manuscripts, I believe, to a antique dealer named Kondo. He doesn't even have a last name. I'm sure he does, but nobody knows what it is. Who was like a guy who just sold stuff.
Like in a flea market type.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and then they a few of the other early scrolls went to somebody who was the head of the Orthodox, I think the Armenian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem. So that's just the beginning. There's all these interesting stories there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how about, so I'd like to know a little bit about, I guess, the contents, the writings that, these manuscripts that the Dead Sea Scrolls contain. At least maybe a good way to start it is about, like, what are the first contents that you started studying, like in your beginning of it? How would you, when you started studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, what contents of it did you, what area was it dealing with that you started studying it, and how, we could just get on to the general basics of, like, what it went into and what you learned.
So, when I first heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls when I was a teenager, and I guess I was either before high school or in high school, and I was almost like afraid to, I would look a little bit, I was curious and afraid at the same time, because I heard that they had biblical texts that were not in our Bible. And I was like, oh no, I don't want to, who would like to find out that there are things that we say the Bible, the way we have the Bible, that's what we got, that's the real deal. And here's these ancient scrolls from over 2,000 years ago that are not matching necessarily. They could match, but not necessarily matching our version of the Bible. So if anything, in the beginning, I was nervous about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I almost didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I kind of put it out of the back of my mind, just like I don't really have interest in, let's say, biblical criticism. Other people who criticize, who I say deconstruct the Bible and come up with different theories of, like some guy a number of years ago came up with different theories of that every book he ever looked at was written by 5 authors. So, and I would hear about these things, and I'm honestly not really interested in challenging the Torah that we have, just because somebody in Germany, nothing against Germans, they were good people up until the war, or the Jewish studies professors who kind of followed in that kind of deconstructive mode. I have nothing against them, but I kind of saw all of that. I saw all of that suspiciously, like part of the Western, like how, I don't want to compare it to how African Americans might think that their culture is stolen. I'm not interested in some historian or some Western.
It's a different world.
What?
It's a different world is one way to put it. Like, it's just a different world.
And I want to preserve what I have. I don't want them to tell me who I am. I'm not interested in they're
coming from a different perspective. There's nothing wrong with academia and history and stuff. It could be interesting to know and informed, but they're coming. You don't need that if you're coming from a religious perspective.
There is something wrong with it when they have a supremacy, meaning when you talk to certain Western thinkers, they literally believe that everybody else is inferior to them, and therefore want everyone to follow along with whatever they say. And this has been going on in the Jewish world, has had to fight against Greek philosophy, Roman thought, from age and antiquity. And if every time some greater power with a big university and endowed professorship came along and told you, bow at my feet, and we listened, we'd have no Judaism. In fact, that's why Judaism is so small. The Jewish people are so small, because we're a people of ideas, and we assimilate easily into the conqueror's ideas. So I'm not interested in the conqueror's ideas. I'm interested in Judaism the way I was taught. I'll listen to what they have to say on my terms, not on their terms. So that's how I kind of thought of the Dead Sea Scrolls, like, another challenge. Now it's coming from history. It's not coming from a contemporary thinker who's analyzing a text in some BS scientific way. I say BS because it's not scientific, it's just their theory. But I saw it as another challenge be avoided at best, or to be understood carefully at the very least. So that's how I treated the Dead Sea Scrolls for 20 years, maybe more, maybe longer, maybe, with kind of a little bit of caution and not much interest, really. Because what I already know, I know. So what do I need? I don't need them to verify what I know. I don't need them to say, well, we have a different version here, so it's going to challenge your version. I'm not interested in that. Therefore, I had little curiosity to really delve into what it says. And what happened is, a number of years ago, I had a day of study that I invited a professor because she had written books about this topic that I didn't even really know at first was related to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The topic I had chosen for the day of study was about the Merkava and the Hechalot literature. This is literature that mostly is seen to be coming from the about 10th, 11th century. It's kind of pre-Kabbalistic or semi-similar to Kabbalah, but not quite Kabbalah, text that describes an ascent that an adept, somebody who would have been practiced in this fine technique, would make to go into the divine chambers. And it would describe in detail these great voids that of distances that had physical dimensions given, with terrifying angels at each gate that would challenge the person in their ascent, in this heavenly ascent. It almost seemed like they were describing heaven in a physical way. And there was a debate about whether people were actually going somewhere to make this ascent, or it was just in their inner self. They were going on this journey in their like sleep state or dream state, or some type of meditation that they were doing. And that is called Hechalot literature. Hechalot literally means a chamber, like a palace. So like the palace, or the various antechambers and divine spatial descriptions and all the beings that inhabit them. And that its counterpart that's very similar to that is called the Merkava literature. Merkava is the divine throne or divine chariot, which is primarily a description that's first found in the first chapter of Yecheskel, Ezekiel, in which Yecheskel has a vision as he's crossing out, going out of Israel, and he's on the river going out of Israel, and he sees instead of the temple in Jerusalem, he sees the heavenly temple, and he sees the four faces of the divine chariot in which God is riding on the divine chariot. And he sees this variety of angels that are described, terrifying vision. And that vision becomes known as Maaseh Merkava. Maaseh Merkava means the work of the chariot, the work of the divine throne. And that's the antecedent to what we call today Kabbalah. And in that context, the Hechalot, the Merkava literature that I was describing, falls into somewhere in between the two, between the Kabbalah and the vision of Yecheskel. Kind of a bridge maybe between the two. So in that context, because we have this annual day of Kabbalah, we hold it at the JCC in Manhattan, here on the West Side. I invited Professor Rachel Elior. She's a professor of Jewish mysticism and Hasidism, but I invited her because she writes about Hechalot literature and Merkava literature. I thought she would talk about that. But instead, what she did is she opened it up to the Dead Sea. She said something really wild. The primary text in the Talmud that deals with this kind of Merkava literature is a story about four men, sages of the Talmud, who entered into the Pardes. They entered into this mystical realm. And it was Rabbi Akiva and Ben Zoma and Elisha ben Avuya. And they each describe, the Talmud describes what happened to each one of them. So for example, Elisha ben Avuya, when he went up, he saw that there was I don't want to say a divine-like figure, but pretty much a powerful angel that would be called Matatron. We don't even say his name. I was taught to just say Matat, that stands short for Matatron. He was sitting and he was inscribing something on a tablet. Now, Elisha ben Avuya had been taught that there is nobody who gets to sit above. There's only one being that sits, which is God. God, so to speak, sits. We call it the divine chariot or throne for a reason, because God is sitting, whatever that means. There's a whole nother discussion. But nobody else gets to sit up above. And here he sees that this angel is sitting as if it's like almost equal to God. So when he comes back from this spiritual ascent, he becomes a heretic. And in heaven, there's a little bit of an uproar that this angel, because of how he appeared to be so powerful, was part of the downfall of misleading Elisha ben Avuya into thinking that there are two rishuyot, the two powers in heaven. There's a divine and a counter, another like opposing, almost as powerful, if not as powerful force. So he thought that, he made this mistake. He goes out and becomes a heretic. So they punish this angelic being with giving him lashes with shishim pulsa denura, 60 lashes with a whip made out of fire, very like Hollywood stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So Rachel Elior says, you know what they were doing? The four that went to enter, what were they studying? They were studying the type of manuscripts that we now find in the Dead Sea Scroll. That's why there's this grave danger. One of them became mentally unsound. The other one died. Elisha ben Avuya became a heretic, and only one of the four, Rabbi Akiva, made it out whole. In other words, this stuff is powerful. It's also dangerous. So that's how I was like, wow. I thought it was a little bit of a stretch, to be honest with you, to take the story of the four that entered into Pardes and the Talmud and Chagiga and somehow connect it to them studying these texts that we now find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a little bit, I still am a little bit skeptical of it, but it captured my imagination. And that's when I was like, okay, let me look a little bit into what's going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
At that point, maybe even though your views on what it seemed like it was, at least you had a fascination. It caught a fascination with you more out of just that incredible story to get into it a bit, get into it a bit more. With that,
correct. Okay. That was the first thing that really like captured my imagination. And then the second thing is, I have to tell you, I made it sound like I'm afraid of facts. I'm afraid of like what historians are going to say, and I am, because I'm not listening to historians with just like, because historians are going to change their mind every week, every day. I'm not. That's not that. History is also only a part of the puzzle, and it's not to replace religion. But I will say, if I find something intriguing that will actually explain what it is that I'm doing, will fill in a missing piece and explain it better, then I'm
Mhm.
interested. Then, okay, tell me what's going on there. And that's how I started reassessing the Dead Sea Scrolls, not as just something that undermines the authority of the biblical text, because I also had been studying, I had become more serious about my study of the Talmud. So much so that I saw a great falsehood being perpetrated in the Jewish world, and definitely in the secular world, about Judaism. Big falsehood. It was perpetrated first by the Catholic Church against the Jews, and then the Jews perpetrated it against themselves during the time of the Enlightenment. And what is this great lie? What is this great untruth and misunderstanding of the Bible? And I have to say, it's not a pure lie, because every pure lie nobody accepts. It's not a pure untruth, because if it's a pure untruth, the Jews wouldn't lie about themselves. It's something that could be easily misunderstood and therefore lied about. What is that? That is the very simple thing, that Jews were accused of being merely legalists. And what I mean by that is they were only interested in the minutia of the law, the small little details of how to analyze how big the amount of matzah they have to eat.
And things like that.
Yes, obsession with the details of the law, not with ethics, not with spirituality, but with these like just very, very specific, didactic,
like rituals and
ritual performance. And that was perpetrated on the Jews by the church and by themselves. I don't know which one is more guilty of it. The church had an argument to make, which is, Jesus focused on the moral, focus on
right. They want to differentiate between
and Jews are focusing on ritual law. They had the reason to kind of like bolster their position. I understand it. It wasn't necessarily anti-Semitic. It was more like competitive. Okay. Now, why would the Jews perpetrate this I say lie, but it's a soft lie. Well, first of all, because if you read the Talmud, you might easily say that's correct. It's full of loss, and it is full of loss. But it's not just full of loss. It's full of understanding our relationship with God. And what's so crazy, but it says it in these weird stories, and it alludes to it. So what happens is in a lot of yeshivas, they will literally skip those sections. I don't really understand what they're talking about. And the other thing is that Jews, and during the time of the Enlightenment, they didn't want to be seen as mystical as a way of being superstitious. They wanted to say the Talmud has an inner logic. So we'll accept the inner logic of the Talmud because there's certain rational elements to it, and we'll skip the rest. So between the church, between the Enlightenment, the focus on science and the rational, Jews started basically ignoring certain sections of the Talmud. One of those sections of the Talmud is the section that if you study it carefully, you'll find hidden pieces of it all over, which is the secret mysteries of our relationship with God that are embedded sometimes in the law and sometimes just in stories and in lore. So in that sense, comparing the Talmud to the Dead Sea Scrolls both tells you where the Dead Sea Scrolls fit in, meaning the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whoever they are, or at least the books of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, we'll get into that in a second.
We'll get into that.
Yeah.
There's a relationship there. Not that we always agree with them. We can disagree with them, but they have a common source.
With the Talmud, there's a certain
It comes after the Talmud. I'm sorry, before
Right.
the Talmud. Because before the Talmud, but the Talmud was aware of certain things, not necessarily from them. They could have been from a common source that we both had, because we weren't living in a vacuum.
Right.
We interacted with these people, and we had common ancestors in the world of the Jewish priesthood, in the world of the Jewish prophets, and the world of the Jewish sages. So by re-examining some of these ideas in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I got to both understand not just what the Talmud might be saying, but what the Talmud is saying it's not. Because sometimes you have to say what you're not like to the person who's closest to you. So now it helps you understand much of the Talmud could be seen as a differentiation from its closest cousins, from the people who were Jewish, but didn't exactly have the exact same view as we have. So it might be like an Orthodox rabbi explaining why he doesn't accept conservative Judaism, or conservative Judaism explaining why they don't accept Orthodox Judaism. So if somebody will read one of those texts in 1,000 years, and that might be their only text that they see, it will shed light on the other movement, even if it's read from the perspective. And if you then get your hands on two of the books, one from the Orthodox rabbi, one from the conservative rabbi, that'll fill in a lot. That'll tell us.
So you felt that learning the Dead Sea Scrolls helped you to learn Talmud more, because it emphasized the differences and the similarities, you know.
Correct. And it explained who the competition was. It explained who the people that they feel like they needed to be wary of, but sometimes give them some respect, but also to explain why we don't accept their way of thinking. And when we do, why we are cautious to do it very carefully. I'll give you one example before we dive deeper into this. And this was brought up by Rachel Elior. I'll give her credit for this one as well. One of the things that you'll find in the Talmud is a strict prohibition against writing down the oral law. So they consider there to be two Torahs, the rabbis, the written law, what we call the Bible, and the oral law, which we would call the Talmud and the Medrash, and all of the rest of the Torah that's not in the Bible. But the thing is, they didn't write anything down. It was all transmitted from teacher to student. They would have to memorize it. They would literally study it 100 times. And if they were a good student, 101 times. And doesn't that seem ridiculous? I mean, they knew how to write.
Yeah.
Just write the thing down. You're driving your students crazy, making them memorize everything. Well, guess what? That's a big difference. The Dead Sea Scrolls were people who wrote everything down. And the rabbis of that same period, or just slightly thereafter, wrote nothing down, because they wanted to why not? Because they wanted to differentiate themselves, to show that the writing period was over. Now the biblical canon, it's closed. You can't add to it anymore. The Dead Sea Scrolls authors thought they could just keep adding and writing new scriptures, and the rabbi said, no, scriptures are gone. And therefore, to show that, we're not even going to write anything. We're just explaining what's already written by orally teaching it, speaking it from teacher to student. And that doesn't make sense to me before this explanation. I mean, there's some logic to it. Okay, there's, but that insistence of not writing it, all of a sudden it made more sense, a lot more sense.
Right. Wow, so that's some pretty interesting stuff. Okay, so there's a lot to get into there that we could, but I guess just to start off, let's go to what you said, that debate about writing and not writing. And I guess if you could say that the writers of the Dead Sea Scroll being sort of a foil, being sort of what it is that was the competitive thought group to the Talmudic rabbis who believed in the oral passing of the information from generation to generation. So that, with that context of of the writing and literature heavy sort of mindset that the makers of the Dead Sea Scrolls had it. Who were they? Who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Or is that an answerable question? How would you break it down?
Okay, so who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? That's a very good question. It's $1 million question. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm by no means an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's just like I said, my entryway into any interest at all in the Dead Sea Scrolls comes out of my interest in ancient mysticism and Talmud. So I never really put serious time into being able to answer that question. But let's break down a little bit of that question to tell you what was originally thought and why that original thought is beginning to take on a little bit of heat. It's not so clear anymore. I say originally, at a certain point, the consensus, and it still remains the consensus, but like I said, there's a crack in that thing, is that it was the Essenes who were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, you're like saying, I see them, but I don't know them. Who are these Essenes? What I'll do is I'll quote from a book by Lawrence Schiffman called Understanding Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism. I think I'll read a little tiny bit of Josephus, because to understand not who the Essenes are, but who people think the Essenes are, you have to read Josephus, because he was so clear in his description of them that it almost like made people think that these are historical facts. Josephus was a Jewish general who became a Roman historian after joining Roman after being captured by the Romans. So this is what he writes. He writes the following. He writes, first of all, there's a question of how they got their name.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's pious or healers or silent. We don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
But there's three sources, early sources. There's Pliny the Elder, who writes very little about them, and then Philo and Josephus.
Mm-hmm.
So the Essenes, the problem with the theory, before I tell you why people had this theory, is all of these texts never identify themselves as Essenes. Mm-hmm. So that would be strange. And the other problem is if from a purely literary standpoint, they seem to identify with Tzadok, with the Bnei Tzadok, with the sons of Tzadok, which are a clan that are associated with a banished group of priests that were kicked out of of controlling the Second Temple during the era of the Hashmonaim, who drove them out of power. So those are the two issues with saying it's the Essenes. But why do people say it's the Essenes? So let me read about the Essenes to answer that question. According to Philo, there was about 4,000 of them. They were scattered in communities throughout the land of Israel. according to Pliny, I mentioned, he does locate them geographically between Jericho and Ein Gedi on the western shore of the Dead Sea. That's the general location of the Qumran of that area, that's why they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're not in the Dead Sea, but they're near the Dead Sea. So again, that's a geographic identifier. I'd rather read to you straight up from what Josephus says than just we'll find out later. Oh, here it is. I found it. Okay. I'm going to read from Josephus directly. This is the translation by Dr. Professor Lawrence Schiffman. They're Jews by birth, but they seem to have greater affection for one another than any other schools have. They reject pleasure as evil, but consider continence and conquest over our passions, meaning self-control, to be virtue. They disdain marriage. So what do they do when it comes to having new recruits? They get other people's children to join them. They don't absolutely deny the fitness of marriage because they understand that some people need to be married. And they guard against the lascivious behavior of women. And they're persuaded that none of them preserve her fidelity to one man. These men are despisers of riches. They don't like money. So the community of goods raises our administration. That basically none of them have any more than another. They have like what we would call today a form of communal living, where they would give all of their, I'm not quoting him directly, just to save time. Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of saying the idea. This is from Josephus. If they would be part of the group, they'd have to relinquish all their personal assets to the group. And they all would be basically taken care of on a very basic level. You couldn't have any super fancy clothes. You couldn't have any fancy horses and jewelry. You just had to live simply. They dressed in white. They ate a simple meal. But what they also did is they prayed every day before sunrise, which brings to bear sections of the Talmud that talk about praying around that time. It's known as Vasikin. So there's already a parallel between the two in that area. Then they would work very fastidiously, and each one of them had a particular skill that they would do. And then in the 5th hour of the day, they would immerse themselves in what we call a mikvah. They'd put on special clothes. They would go into special dining room. They were each given bread. Many of the eating habits of how they would eat are mirrors of, or related or connected to, how Jewish rituals were around the table in the section of the Gemara Brachos that describes the blessings and who would eat first. There's a lot of parallels there. Now, doesn't mean they're the same, but they're very interestingly similar. So, for example, they would have a group of 10. We know that 10 allows you to make a special blessing that you can't make the exact same blessing if you have 9. And it would be led by a Kohen. We know that we do prefer to have a Kohen lead certain rituals today. Now, a lot of what they do is about, the reason why they're connected to silence is that if there's a group, they don't get to speak, especially if the group doesn't want one of them to speak. If the majority have a certain opinion, the minority just like kind of keep quiet. Not everybody gets to voice their opinion about everything. You have to have permission to speak, so to speak, if you are in the minority. They also have a way of allowing people in which for a full year, they don't really let them in. And then even after that, they're on probation for the next 2 years. And once they come in, they have to make a serious oath. Okay, there's a lot here. The reason why I'm telling you this to answer your question is there are texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls that mirror some of these practices. Not all, but many of these practices about sharing, about eating habits, are similar in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it seems that the first person who was really in charge of the excavation and the research was I believe it was a priest. I'm not sure, but he probably misunderstood the nature of what he called the writing room. He had another fancy word for the writing room of the scribes. He believed that there were 200 people living in this Qumran community, and that they were celibate. And to him, they thought, well, wow, this is like the Roman Catholic Church, and they thought that this is like where Jesus must have come from. Like, where else would they get this idea? Not people after the fact that the Catholic Church became promoting celibacy amongst the priesthood, they wanted to kind of put that back on early Christianity or even pre-Christianity. A lot of those theories started becoming discredited, or at least if not fully discredited, argued that it was not the sect living in Qumran that wrote necessarily Dead Sea Scrolls. There were not 200 people that living there per se. That would be very unbelievable to think. And that it might have been a library that the library itself is written over the course of almost some 300 years, well over 200 years. So it might have been coming in from people who were leaving Jerusalem because the Romans were coming. The Romans came. It might have been people who wanted to put away their libraries, their respective libraries, or some great libraries that were already in existence that were being moved to a new, safer location, which is one of the new theories. And that would then say it isn't necessarily the Essenes who wrote it, because it wasn't written by the people living in that area. So that already leads us to the next answer to the question: is it was not the Essenes. It was either the B'nai Tzadok, or yet a third group, or a combination of groups. So, the consensus still is that it's the Essenes, but that is being seriously reevaluated. I don't think it's going to hold for very long. Or they're going to come up with this theory that that either really it's what we call the B'nai Tzadok are really much more like the Essenes than we thought. At least this group was. And they're going to divide. They're going to either have to divide the Essenes into two groups, or the B'nai Tzadok into two groups, and that's what's going to end up happening. Is my prediction.
Or it could possibly be written by people who, were either from B'nai Tzadok influenced by the Essenes, or vice versa, like an influence.
Correct.
There were all these sort of during that time, interesting sects of Judaism. This was predating Christians, but this was, before the Romans invaded, and there was starting to be, obviously, with a lot of debate and controversy around from the standard Talmudic, well, not Talmudic at the time, but the standard rabbis and hierarchy, a lot about what was like true and based in Judaism, but there were different streams of thoughts in different areas of Israel at that time. So it could be many possibility of things and overlapping influences. So it's all very interesting.
So Naomi, I just wanted to say that, but I to talk about what was actually written there, I think we should make that a separate session, because I have a Talmud class coming up, talk about Talmud. But yes, I think the answer to your $1 million question is let's wait and see. We don't, even though they say there's a consensus, I don't really think there's a real, the consensus is based on research that's very fluid right now. So I don't know how long that consensus is going to be. I think it's being reevaluated very seriously. And before you reevaluate something, first there has to be a crack in the consensus. So now a lot of the professors are respectfully saying stuff like, well, there's a consensus, but it might not be that, and saying like another opinion as people begin to realize that the complexity of the environment then was very different than they thought. First of all, there weren't just like these 5 groups. We always talk about the Essenes and the Sadducees, or we'll call it Saddukim, or I'm calling them the Bnei Tzadok, and these or the Baisusin, and we make it as Samaritans is like there's these 5 groups, when in reality there was probably 20 or 30 groups. And or as you could say, there might have been subgroups, and historians and rabbis have often lumped them together for a variety of reasons. First of all, who wants to explain 25 groups? Who has the head to do that? We acknowledge that Gemara acknowledges a number of other groups, but doesn't really have the time or patience to get into the details of what differentiates them one from another. So they almost have to make them like the other, right? It's like today, I know Orthodox rabbis who lump together Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Liberal, Orthodox, all in one thing. It's just that it's like all of those people. It's a little bit disrespectful, but it's also because they're just like, this is who we are and we're not them. So history does that. The Talmud does that. And what's fascinating is they're not necessarily denying the existence of these subgroups. It's just nobody bothered really doing a proper identification, classification. And that's that's being done right now. So that will probably answer your question when they're doing. So here's interesting, because it's work, literature, study of ancient literature that's being done together with studying, for example, linen that they found at the caves that would seem to support that it may be Essenes, because the linen is white and simple. But so we're doing a lot of different stuff. I think people are looking at this from a lot of different angles, and soon I think a new consensus will reemerge, which is going to reshuffle what we have been saying. But it's either not going to be the Essenes, or it's going to be a different version of Essenes than what we thought Essenes were, and that's really already underway.
Right. Well, that's all very fascinating. Yes, of course, this is something that we could get into for a long time, and I definitely would love to, and another time, return to the topic of getting really into the meats of the ideas and what is discussed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But just to top it off for now, when you did get more after this whole, this story that set you on this sort of spark of curiosity about the Dead Sea Scrolls, we talked about earlier what have sort of turned you off for it when you were younger, before you had that, and when you did get into what those contents were, how has your opinion changed, or or has it, what is your sort of outlook on some of the main things expressed that you've learned in the Dead Sea Scrolls now, you would say?
That's a great question. How's my opinion changed from when I was a teenager? Well, I'm not necessarily as fearful of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because as I studied more Talmud, I understood that there were always other opinions. We never had. Look, we just learned the Torah reading about Korach's rebellion. Even in Moses' leadership was being challenged. There was never a time in Judaism where there was one authority that everybody really submitted to. I mean, if there was, it lasted all of 5 minutes, right? So, like, that's the way it is. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. That's always the way we've been, and I don't know if it'll always be the way we will be. But if you study the Talmud is very well aware of other groups of Jews who did things differently, and this, if anything, illuminates what some of their practices were, which we could talk about in another video when we talk about what the texts actually say, to give you more details of where we were all Jews, but we didn't always have the same scripture. They had additional scripture to fill in what they felt we were missing. We had Medrash and Talmud to fill in what was not in our version of the written Torah. We have almost the identical written Torah of what we call the Tanakh. That's pretty much the same, not exactly the same, and there were probably different versions going around then, and we came up with what we believe to be the truer version, but that's obviously a matter of debate. But so as I started reassessing what the nature of the Dead Sea Scrolls is. It's in light of the fact that I just knew enough about the Talmud to understand that it's okay to have other biblical like groups that had our Bible or almost our Bible, and also had additional works. The Gemara talks about Apocrypha, which is like biblical style work that we don't accept as part of the Torah. For whatever reason, we have our reasons. The Talmud discusses why one of them had wisdom in it. Why don't we accept it, and gives reasons why we don't. So it just adds to my understanding of the Talmud. It doesn't take away, and therefore that helped me reassess it. Not that I think every word of the Dead Sea Scrolls is Torah, I don't, but it helps me understand Torah. So that's why I've changed my way of not being afraid of it, but instead seeing how it adds to understanding the Talmud, understanding Judaism, even today.
So I guess your it sounds like your main benefit from it was, having more understanding of the Torah and Talmud and the stuff that you do already, believe obviously quite passionately already before. Were there any ideas that maybe surprisingly you found quite compelling, or did you end up, or ideas that you found were like compelled you more into those ideas or certain ideas in Torah or Talmud? You don't have to get into what they were and all that, but did you, or?
Let's leave that, because I think we'll do that when we do a more focused description of what's in their text. Let's leave that, because I want to leave something interesting for our next video to get into what they actually say, and then I can actually do some comparative things of what the rabbis say about that, where they do agree, where they don't agree, and let's leave that. And let's wrap this up now.
More into the crux, but did you find anything compelling? Like, don't say what it is, but were you something surprised? Okay, good. So we can get into it.
Let's leave that as a cliffhanger for the next one. Love talking to you, Naomi. I'm glad that this is something you enjoyed as well as I did, and I look forward to our next session coming up soon.
Yes, thank you so much. It's so nice. Bye-bye.
Bye.